let me go back again to the point of how far should we go or can we go? Because those are two different issues. Many of the critics, such as Francis Fukuyama, say that transhumanism, which is a word I would come back to a bit later, is the most dangerous idea at the moment that humanity faces. Another person in your book, in the very beginning of it, George Annas is his name, who is a liberal philosopher and a bioethicist, has called genetic engineering in specific to be a crime against humanity. I, by the way, had a similar experience one night when we were going to the pre-wedding party of a friend of my wife's, and there was this guy who is a microbiologist and who said that people who work on life extension technology should be shot because they're wasting resources and valuable scientific time.
Yeah.
So there are all those sort of, I don't want to call them extreme attacks, but very substantial critics coming in from those points of view. How do you deal with them? What do you say in response?
Well, first I'd say that fear and revulsion of new technologies, especially biological technologies, has always existed. When the first smallpox vaccine was developed, it was developed in a way that many of us would find sort of gross if we watched it. It was scraping tissue from cowpox, a disease on the surface of cows, and using that, injecting that into humans, inoculated them against smallpox. And because we have this kind of deep-seated revulsion to biological change, that caused a massive backlash. Newspapers ran editorial cartoons showing half-man, half-cow monsters and calling this unnatural. The first blood transfusions got similar responses. The use of anesthetics during childbirth was actually much derided and called unnatural until I believe Queen Victoria took up the cause and said, no, look, you haven't had a kid. When you're going to have a baby, if you're a woman, you will want this. So it's very natural for people to have fear. And to some extent, a little bit of fear is healthy. We should investigate these things. We should look at what the risks are and the downsides. But when we actually do, we find far more upside than downside.
Yeah, and if I remember I don't remember if it was the smallpox vaccine or one of the other vaccines which used hundreds of thousands of monkeys to be tested throughout time. And of course, all of those unfortunately died from smallpox usually. But on the upside, it had saved millions of human lives.
More, yeah.
Or hundreds of millions, yes, and for the last century. So I personally think the price was worth it.
Yes.
But
to cut to Fukuyama's point that transhumanism is the most dangerous idea, the thing that I want to get across is that it's not a new idea. You know, for time immemorial, as long as our species has existed, people have sought out ways to improve on themselves, to make themselves healthier, to live a little bit longer, to do good things for their kids. Anybody who sends their child to a paid preschool or wants to, read to them when they're 1 year old, all of these, what are those but ways of seeking biological enhancement? You're looking for ways to rewire the brain of your child. Anybody who uses antibiotics, or certainly the people who spend $20 billion a year in the U.S. on sports supplements, most of which don't work that well. What is that but the idea of human enhancement, of self-enhancement?
so the downside of not having a limit of how far we can push human development in the process of becoming constantly more than human and then more than human and so on has been pointed out on numerous occasions. I mean, you can give examples from Greek mythology in the cases of Tithonus and Eos. You can give the Oscar Wildean example of Dorian Gray. You have Faust. You have Frankenstein with Mary Shelley. And the argument goes that the risks are so big that not only the scientist who invents that Frankensteinian monster can suffer for it,
Yes.
but the rest of humanity can also go down along in the process. So, given those huge risks for the rest of us, shouldn't we just stop testing and such development altogether?
Well, I think fiction demands danger and risk, and the risk of catastrophe makes a good story. None of those would have sold a lot of copies had everything just gone very well. But you know, when Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, life expectancy on this planet was probably around 30 years. And today it's more than double that across the planet, 67, 68 years worldwide now. And it's 80 years in many developed countries. So, contrary to the moral of Frankenstein or some of those other stories, the effects of this new technology, including technologies that affect biology, antibiotics being one of the very big ones, that effect has been largely incredibly positive. Sure, it's come with some downsides. Almost every new technology has some downsides, but the overall effect has been incredibly positive, actually.
Okay, so let me ask you about the biggest dream of people in terms of positive effect, which
Okay?
is overcoming death. I mean, because that's the bottom line. If you can extend life indefinitely, then in a way you have conquered death. So, has the time come for death to die?
Well, that's a big question and eloquently asked. Um, I don't think we will ever get rid of death entirely. I think there's a lot of work on addressing many of the causes of death. Infectious disease, I would say, is one of the ones we're making a lot of progress against. But I think what you were really asking about was aging. And so I do think that we're at the threshold of being able to slow down, possibly halt, and possibly reverse the human aging process. And I think that would have quite a lot of positive benefit to the world. As we get older, our vulnerability to disease of all sort increases, our healthcare costs rise, and our capabilities start to dwindle. If we could delay that, not only would it be a personal boon to those who are able to live with more youth and more health for longer, it would be a global boon by being able to keep around the experience and wisdom of these people and keep them smart and adaptable and not requiring as much spending in healthcare.
Mhm. So let me ask you about one very interesting particular case that I read in your book, and that was about those mice that after undergoing certain kind of gene alteration were able to live 30, 50, or 100% longer lifespans than an average mouse is expected to live. But the interesting thing is that they would die suddenly and over a very short period of time, while just before that they looked perfectly healthy, and it is almost, I mean, it looked like it was almost impossible to come up with a cause of death. How does that
Mhm.
happen? And then doesn't that say that there's some kind of a natural limiter beyond which we cannot go?
Well, so there are two ways to delay death effectively. One is to treat the symptoms of aging, to treat heart disease, treat cancer, treat Alzheimer's disease, et cetera, et cetera. The other is to affect the fundamental rate of aging that happens in us. So when we treat the symptoms of aging, we're fighting a losing battle. Even if you eliminated all cancer deaths, life expectancy in the United States would go up by 2 or 3 years, a shockingly small amount for getting rid of all cancer. Why? Because as you get older, your risk of everything goes up. There's something called the Gompertz curve, which is that every 7 years, your risk of death in total doubles. So even if you got rid of cancer, your risk of heart disease is going up, your risks of Alzheimer's are going up, your risk of stroke is going up, and so on and so on and so forth. So the other approach is to actually address the underlying process of aging. And when we do that, animals, we've done it, stay young longer And they do show this phenomenon of staying healthy up until the very end, and then one of their systems goes, and then they die. But they don't show the model that people fear of frail old age. They're not bedridden and sick and in horrible pain and soaking up tremendous healthcare spending for the last period of their lives,
Mhm.
as many humans are today. They stay young and spry, and then they just go like that, which I think is a healthier model in many ways.
Yeah, I think it's both cheaper and it creates less suffering for the person who dies. I mean, it's one thing to die
That's right.
bedridden for the last 5 years of your life or something, suffering throughout that whole period. It's another thing to die over a day. Uh, uh,
That's right.
so I think both ethically for the minimization of suffering and economically for the minimization of cost, I think that's definitely preferable. But yeah, go ahead.
A- And if extended to humans, that would allow humans to contribute for longer in their lives. So imagine you had 60 or 70 or 80 or 90-year-olds who had
Mhm.
all of their accumulated wisdom and experience, but were as mentally sharp and as able to learn new things as they were when they were age 20. They'd have a lot to offer to society.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the old saying goes that every time a human being dies, a library burns, and
Yes,
I think that's very true because I mean, all of us have learned throughout our lives, hopefully, and uh, it's a waste that we haven't found better ways of communicating this whole knowledge to the next generation. So prolonging our health lifespan increases that possibility to communicate it to the rest of society, which would benefit from it. And in fact, you can argue that GDP growth, economic growth, all kinds of growth, progress is based on the ability of one generation to transmit its sort of collective knowledge based on which the next generation builds upon.
that's right. That's exactly right. There's a case study in this, bit of a tangent, but in the early 1500s, I believe, eyeglasses were invented in Europe, and they had a remarkable ability. Up until that point, nearly all craftsmen had to stop working in their 40s because they just stopped being able to see things.
Yeah.
And so there was a burst of economic growth produced by craftsmen being able to work for 10 or 20 years longer because now they could see. So it's a similar situation on a much larger scale if we can slow aging.
Yeah, that's actually a fantastic example I wasn't aware of. Um, but I'd like to refocus our discussion here by going back to the very beginning of your book, if I may. I mean, we've touched upon the sort of biggest, most powerful criticisms and about the biggest promises, perhaps. But if I'm to put this book in a single paragraph to somebody who hasn't read it, I'd like to read to them this.
Okay?
This book is based on a very different premise, which is to say different than the premise from Francis Fukuyama and the other bioethicists who criticized any tinkering with the genetic structure of humanity. Rather than fearing change, we ought to embrace it. Rather than prohibiting the exploration of new technologies, society ought to focus on spreading the power to alter our own minds and bodies to as many people as possible. Rather than imposing a rigid view of what it means to be human on humanity, we ought to trust billions of individuals and families to decide that for themselves.
Yes.
I think that was in the very beginning of your book, and I think that's a very succinct way of communicating about what the whole book is all about, and I think it's fantastic. But let me ask you about something that's not in the book, actually.
Okay.
There's two things which are missing here, at least, and I want to ask you first this.